She wore the same necklace every single day for 30 years. A cheap piece of silver she found clutched in her tiny baby hand when they discovered her abandoned in a hospital bathroom. It was the only proof that someone, somewhere, had held her before throwing her away. Ruby never knew that necklace would make a billionaire cry in the middle of a crowded restaurant. She never knew it would unlock a secret so dark, so cruel, that it would send 4 people to prison. And she definitely never knew that the woman sobbing at table 7 wasn't crying because the necklace was beautiful. She was crying because 30 years ago, she had placed that exact locket around her newborn granddaughter's neck, just hours before someone stole that baby and made her disappear forever. This is the true story of how a 20-pound necklace destroyed a criminal conspiracy and brought a family back from the dead.
Stay with me.
Because what happened next will break your heart, and then put it back together again. Welcome to the story room. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your view on the story and where you're watching from. Let me tell you about a moment that proves miracles can happen in the most ordinary places. It was a regular Thursday afternoon in London, the kind of day where nothing special is supposed to happen. But sometimes life has other plans. In a fancy restaurant called the Garden Room, tucked away in the heart of the city, a young woman named Ruby was working her shift. She was 27 years old, with tired eyes but a warm smile. Ruby had been waiting tables for 6 months now, saving every pound she could. Her dream was simple. She wanted to become a teacher. She wanted to help children who felt lost, the way she once felt. Ruby wore the same thing every day: a black uniform, comfortable shoes, and a small silver locket around her neck. That locket was nothing expensive, just a simple heart-shaped pendant on a thin chain. But to Ruby, it was everything.
It was the only thing she had from her past.
The only clue about where she came from. You see, Ruby didn't know her parents. She had grown up in the care system, moving from one foster home to another. As a baby, someone had left her in a hospital bathroom in Birmingham, all alone. The only thing with her was a blanket and that silver locket. For 27 years, she had worn it every single day, wondering who had left it with her and why. On this particular Thursday, an elderly woman walked into the garden room. Her name was Dorothy Harrison, and she was 72 years old. Dorothy wasn't just any customer. She was one of the richest women in England. She had built a real estate empire worth billions, buying and selling properties across Europe. People knew her as the Iron Lady of London, tough, smart, and never showing emotion. Dorothy had perfectly styled gray hair, an expensive coat, and diamond rings that caught the light. She carried herself like royalty. In her world, she controlled everything. But there was one thing she couldn't control: the pain of losing her daughter 30 years ago. When Ruby approached Dorothy's table to take her order, something strange happened. Dorothy looked up and saw the locket around Ruby's neck. Her face went completely pale. Her hands started shaking. She stared at that simple piece of jewelry like she had seen a ghost. "Where did you get that?" Dorothy whispered, her voice cracking. Ruby froze. In all her months working here, she had never seen anyone react like this. Especially not someone as powerful as Dorothy Harrison. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Ruby said quietly. "Is something wrong?" But Dorothy wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on the locket. Tears started rolling down her cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. The whole restaurant went silent. People at other tables stopped eating. They pulled out their phones and started recording. Dorothy Harrison never cried in public. Never. "Please," Dorothy said, her voice breaking. "Please tell me where you got that necklace." Ruby's heart was pounding. Her manager, a strict man named Philip, was already rushing over. He looked angry and worried at the same time. The last thing he needed was a scene with one of their most important customers. "Mrs. Harrison, is everything all right?" Philip asked smoothly. "I apologize if there's been any problem. I need to speak with her," Dorothy said, pointing at Ruby. "Alone. Right now." The restaurant was completely quiet now. Everyone was watching. Ruby felt like she couldn't breathe. She had no idea what was happening. This locket had been with her since she was a baby. It was the only thing she had. Why would this rich woman care about it? Philip nodded stiffly. 5 minutes in my office, he said. Dorothy stood up and threw a pile of money on the table without counting it. Then she looked at Ruby with eyes full of tears and desperation.
Please, she begged.
Just give me 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. Ruby followed Dorothy through the restaurant. She could feel everyone staring at her. Whispers followed them like shadows. She was just a waitress. Dorothy Harrison was like a queen. Whatever this was about, Ruby knew her life was about to change forever. In the small office at the back of the restaurant, Dorothy closed the door. Her hands were still shaking. She looked at Ruby with an expression that was hard to describe. Hope and fear mixed together. That locket, Dorothy began, her voice thick with emotion. I gave it to my daughter 30 years ago. Ruby felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She grabbed the edge of the desk to steady herself. I don't understand, she whispered. Dorothy pulled out her phone with trembling fingers. She scrolled through her photos until she found what she was looking for. Then she held the screen toward Ruby. The photo showed a young woman, maybe in her early 20s. She had long brown hair and a bright smile. She was pregnant, her hand resting gently on her belly. And around her neck was a locket exactly like the one Ruby wore. Her name was Sarah, Dorothy said softly. My daughter. My only child. Ruby stared at the photo. The woman looked kind,
Happy. Real.
What happened to her? Ruby asked, though part of her already knew the answer would break her heart. Dorothy's face crumpled with pain. She died 30 years ago. She was giving birth in a hospital in Birmingham. There were complications. The baby survived, but Sarah didn't make it. She paused, struggling to continue. Tears ran freely down her face now. I was in France when it happened, working on a business deal. By the time I got back to England, they told me the baby had been adopted. They said it was already done. A private adoption. Final. I hired investigators. I spent millions trying to find that baby. My grandchild. But the trail went cold. It was like the baby just vanished. Ruby couldn't speak.
Couldn't think.
Her legs felt weak, so she sat down in the chair behind her. You're saying? Ruby started, but couldn't finish the sentence. I'm saying that locket belonged to my daughter, Dorothy interrupted, her voice stronger now. And the only person who should have it is her child. My grandchild. The room was spinning. Ruby had spent her whole life wondering why someone had left her. She had imagined 1,000 different stories. But never this. Never this. Ruby's voice came out as barely a whisper. I was never adopted. Dorothy's expression changed from hope to confusion. What do you mean? I grew up in foster care, Ruby explained, her own tears starting to fall now. They found me in a hospital bathroom. Someone had left me there with just this locket and a blanket. I moved from home to home until I turned 18. Nobody ever adopted me. Nobody wanted me. The words hung heavy in the air. Dorothy pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. A bathroom, she repeated. You were found in a bathroom? Which hospital? Birmingham General, Ruby confirmed. 30 years ago. March 23rd. Dorothy's whole body seemed to freeze. That's the hospital where Sarah died. March 23rd was the day she gave birth. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was too terrible to accept. Ruby had spent 30 years feeling unwanted, abandoned. She had worn this locket wondering if her mother had even loved her at all.
But now.
Someone took you, Dorothy said, and her voice was hard now. Cold. Someone at that hospital took you and left you in that bathroom. They stole you from me. Ruby felt like she might be sick.
Why?
Why would anyone do that? Because you are worth millions, Dorothy said bitterly. As my only grandchild, you would inherit everything. Sarah wasn't married. There was no father in the picture. That meant you were my sole heir. Someone must have thought they could profit if you disappeared. The cruelty of it was overwhelming. Ruby had grown up with nothing. She had worn donated clothes and eaten free school meals. She had worked 3 jobs just to save enough for community college. And all that time, she had a grandmother, a family, a fortune, that should have been hers. We need proof, Ruby said, forcing herself to think clearly. We can't just assume because of a necklace. Dorothy nodded quickly. DNA test. I have a private lab that can rush the results. We can know for certain within hours. And if it's true? Ruby asked, her voice breaking. How do we find who did this? It's been 30 years. Dorothy's expression changed. The grief in her eyes transformed into something fierce and determined. We find them, she said simply, and we make them pay. What neither woman knew was that the person responsible was standing just outside the door. Philip, the restaurant manager, had his ear pressed against the wood. His face was white as paper. Sweat dripped down his back. 30 years ago, Philip hadn't been a restaurant manager. He had been a nurse at Birmingham General Hospital. A nurse with gambling debts he couldn't pay. A nurse who had been approached by someone offering him £50,000 to make a baby disappear. He had told himself it would be fine. Someone would find the baby. She would be adopted by a nice family. He would pay his debts and never gamble again. But things hadn't gone the way he planned. The baby had been in that bathroom for hours before someone discovered her. By then, Philip had already left Birmingham and started a new life in London, trying to forget what he had done. And now, 30 years later, that baby was working in his restaurant. And her grandmother, one of the most powerful women in Britain, was about to uncover everything. Philip's hands shook as he backed away from the door. He needed to think.
He needed a plan.
But what could he do? The woman who had paid him, who had orchestrated the whole thing, was dead. She had died 15 years ago in a car crash. But she had left something behind. A letter. Insurance, she had called it. A letter in a safety deposit box that detailed everything. Names, dates, bank transfers. At the time, Philip had thought it protected him. Now he realized it was evidence that would send him to prison. Inside the office, Dorothy was already making phone calls. Her voice was commanding, powerful. Within 30 minutes, a private DNA testing team arrived at the restaurant. They took samples from both Dorothy and Ruby. The test was fast and efficient. 3 hours later, the preliminary results came back. 6 hours after that, they had confirmation. Ruby Torres, the name she had been given by social services, was actually Ruby Harrison, Dorothy's granddaughter. The missing heir. The stolen baby. When Dorothy told her the results, Ruby broke down completely. All the pain of 30 years came pouring out. The loneliness. The feeling of being unwanted. The nights she had cried herself to sleep wondering why her mother had left her. It had all been a lie. She had been loved. She had been wanted. Someone had just taken that away from her. Dorothy held her granddaughter for the first time, and they both wept. 30 years of missed moments. 30 years of birthdays and Christmases and ordinary days that should have been spent together.
Gone.
Stolen. But Dorothy didn't stay sad for long. The grief transformed into fury, into determination. She pulled away from Ruby and wiped her eyes. Listen to me, Dorothy said firmly. We can't change what happened, but we can make sure the people responsible pay for what they did. Will you let me fight for you? Ruby nodded, unable to speak. Then we start now, Dorothy said. I'm going to hire the best investigators in the country. We're going to find every person who was involved, every person who knew, every person who stayed silent, and we're going to make sure they face justice. By morning, the story had exploded across every news outlet in Britain. Billionaire's missing granddaughter found working as waitress. DNA test confirms restaurant worker is Harrison heir. 30 years later, stolen baby mystery solved. But Dorothy wasn't interested in the media attention. She was interested in finding the truth. She hired former police detectives and forensic accountants. She demanded the hospital turn over every record from 30 years ago. She used her wealth and influence to force open doors that had been closed for decades. And slowly, piece by piece, the truth emerged. The investigation took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of digging through old files and forgotten records. 3 weeks of following money trails that had gone cold decades ago. But Dorothy Harrison was relentless.
She didn't sleep. She didn't rest.
She pushed her investigators to work around the clock. And finally, they found it. The connection. Philip, the restaurant manager, had worked as a nurse at Birmingham General 30 years ago. The same hospital, the same time period. And more importantly, there was a deposit of £50,000 into his bank account just days after Ruby was abandoned. Money that came from a shell company. Money that could be traced back to one person. Victoria Brennan. Victoria had been Dorothy's business partner 30 years ago. They had built the real estate empire together, buying properties and developing them across London. But what Dorothy had known was that Victoria had been stealing from the company for years. Millions of pounds, hidden in complex financial arrangements that Dorothy's accountants never caught. When Sarah got pregnant, Victoria saw an opportunity. If Dorothy's grandchild disappeared, Dorothy would be devastated. She would fall apart. The business would suffer. And Victoria could swoop in and take control of everything. It had almost worked. After Sarah died and the baby vanished, Dorothy had indeed fallen apart. She had spent years barely able to function, drowning in grief. The company's value plummeted. Victoria came within inches of a complete takeover. But Dorothy had survived. Somehow, she had found the strength to rebuild. She had fought back and saved her company. Victoria's plan had failed. And 15 years ago, Victoria had died in a car accident. The investigation had found nothing suspicious at the time, but now Dorothy wondered. Had it really been an accident? Or had Victoria taken her own life, knowing her crimes would eventually be discovered?
It didn't matter now.
Victoria was gone. But she had accomplices. People who had helped her. People who had benefited from the stolen money and the stolen baby. When Dorothy's investigators confronted Philip, he broke down immediately. He told them everything. About Victoria approaching him when he was desperate. About the £50,000. About leaving baby Ruby in that bathroom and running away. About the letter in the safety deposit box that detailed the entire conspiracy. "I'm sorry," Philip sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I was drowning in debt. I didn't know what else to do. I thought someone would find her quickly. I thought she'd be okay." Dorothy looked at him with cold fury. "You left my granddaughter in a bathroom.
Alone.
She could have died. And instead, she spent 30 years in foster care, feeling unwanted and abandoned. Your apology means nothing." Ruby stood beside her grandmother, watching Philip cry. Part of her wanted to feel sympathy. But she couldn't. This man's choices had shaped her entire life. All the pain, all the loneliness, all the nights wondering why she wasn't good enough to be loved. It was all because of him. "I want justice," Ruby said quietly. "I want everyone involved to pay for what they did." Dorothy nodded. "They will. I promise you that." The investigators retrieved the letter from Victoria's safety deposit box. It was exactly as Philip had described, a detailed confession, signed and notarized. Victoria had documented everything, perhaps as insurance against her accomplices betraying her, or perhaps out of some twisted sense of pride in her scheme. The letter named 3 other people: an accountant who had helped hide the stolen money, a lawyer who had falsified adoption records to make it look like Ruby had been legally adopted, and a hospital administrator who had covered up the investigation into how a baby ended up abandoned in a bathroom. All 3 were still alive. All 3 had built comfortable lives on blood money and lies. Dorothy handed all the evidence to the police and the district attorney. At first, they were hesitant. The crimes were old. Some witnesses were dead. It would be difficult to prosecute. But Dorothy Harrison didn't accept excuses. She used every ounce of her influence. She went to the media. She generated public pressure. She made it impossible for the authorities to ignore. "My granddaughter deserves justice," she told reporters outside the district attorney's office. "She was stolen from me. Her childhood was stolen from her. And the people responsible are walking free, living comfortable lives. That ends now." The public response was overwhelming. People were outraged. How could something like this happen? How could a baby be stolen and no one be held accountable? The district attorney had no choice but to move forward with charges. The trial began 6 months later. The courtroom was packed every single day. Ruby sat beside her grandmother, watching as the truth was finally exposed for everyone to see. Philip testified first, explaining his role in exchange for a reduced sentence. He described how Victoria had approached him, how desperate he had been, how he had convinced himself that what he was doing wasn't really that bad. "I told myself she'd be fine," Philip said, his voice shaking. "I told myself someone would find her and give her a good home. But I was lying to myself. I knew what I was doing was wrong, and I did it anyway because I needed the money." The accountant tried to claim he didn't know what the money was for. He said he had just been following Victoria's instructions, creating the shell companies and hiding the transactions. But the letter proved he knew. Victoria had written about their conversations, about how he had advised her on the best way to make the money untraceable. The lawyer was even worse. He had actually created fake adoption papers, making it look like Ruby had been legally adopted by a family in Scotland. Those papers had prevented investigators from finding Ruby for years. When Dorothy's private detectives had tried to track her granddaughter, they had followed that false trail and hit a dead end. "I was just doing my job," the lawyer insisted. "My client asked me to prepare adoption documents. I prepared them." But the prosecution showed that he had backdated documents and forged signatures. He had known exactly what he was doing. The hospital administrator's defense was that he had simply been overwhelmed. When a nurse found baby Ruby in that bathroom, he had been concerned about the hospital's reputation. He had wanted to avoid a scandal. So, he had quietly arranged for the baby to be placed with social services without investigating how she ended up there or who her parents were. "I made a mistake," he admitted. "But I didn't know about any conspiracy. I was just trying to protect the hospital." The prosecution argued that his failure to investigate had allowed the criminals to get away with their crime. If he had done his job properly, Ruby would have been identified as Sarah Harrison's daughter immediately. She would have been reunited with Dorothy within days. The trial lasted 6 months. Every day, Ruby listened to people explain why they had made the choices that ruined her life. Every day, she heard excuses and justifications. And every day, she felt her grandmother's hand squeeze hers, reminding her that she wasn't alone anymore. When the verdicts came in, the courtroom held its breath. And if you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to subscribe, because this is only the beginning. Philip, 15 years in prison. The accountant, 12 years. The lawyer, 10 years. The hospital administrator, 8 years for criminal negligence and obstruction of justice. Additionally, the hospital was ordered to pay £20 million in damages for their systemic failures that allowed this to happen. Ruby watched as each person was led away in handcuffs. She didn't feel satisfaction exactly. She felt empty. These punishments couldn't give her back the 30 years she had lost. They couldn't erase the trauma of foster care, the loneliness, the constant feeling that she wasn't wanted. But as she looked at her grandmother's face, she saw something else.
Pride.
Strength. Determination. "This is just the beginning," Dorothy said softly. "Now we make sure it never happens again." After the trial ended, Ruby moved into her grandmother's home. It was a beautiful penthouse in central London with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Growing up, Ruby had cleaned houses like this as a teenager, earning pocket money. She never imagined she would actually live in one. But Dorothy made it clear from the beginning, this wasn't about money or mansions. This was about family. "I don't want you to feel pressured," Dorothy said one evening as they sat together looking out at the city lights. "You don't have to work in my business. You don't have to be anyone other than who you are. I just want to know you. I want to make up for lost time." Ruby appreciated that more than she could say. She had spent 30 years being nobody, having nothing. Suddenly, having everything was overwhelming. "I still want to be a teacher," Ruby admitted. "That hasn't changed." Dorothy smiled warmly. "Then you'll be a teacher. The best teacher you can be. And I'll support you in any way you need." True to her word, Dorothy paid for Ruby to complete her education degree at Oxford University. Ruby was older than most of her classmates, and sometimes she felt out of place. But she worked hard, driven by the memory of all those years when education had been a luxury she couldn't afford. During her studies, Ruby kept thinking about all the children still in foster care. Children who felt the way she had felt, unwanted, invisible, like they didn't matter. She thought about the flaws in the system that had failed her. And she realized something important. She had been given an incredible opportunity. Not just the money, but the platform, the voice, the power to actually change things. And if she didn't use that power to help others, then what was it all for? One night, she shared her idea with Dorothy. "I want to start a foundation," Ruby said, "to reform the foster care system, to make sure no child falls through the cracks like I did, to provide resources and support, to fix what's broken." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears this time. "Your mother would be so proud of you," she said softly. "Sarah always wanted to help people. She was studying to be a doctor before she got pregnant. She had so many plans to make the world better." Ruby felt a connection to the mother she never knew. Through Dorothy's stories, Sarah was becoming real, not just a tragedy, but a person with dreams and hopes. "Then let's do it for her," Ruby said. "Let's call it the Sarah Harrison Foundation." Dorothy agreed immediately. She funded the foundation with £50 million to start. Within weeks, they had assembled a team of experts, social workers, psychologists, former foster children who had succeeded against the odds, policy advocates, and lawyers who specialized in children's rights. The foundation's mission was clear: ensure no child in the care system felt invisible or forgotten. They started with practical help. The foundation partnered with schools to provide tutoring and mentoring for children in foster care. They created a program that gave each child a dedicated advocate, someone who would show up to their school events, remember their birthdays, and make sure they knew someone cared. They provided scholarships for foster children to attend university or vocational training. They helped older teens transitioning out of care find housing and employment. They offered counseling and support groups. But Ruby wanted to go deeper. She wanted to change the system itself. The foundation began lobbying for legislative reform. They pushed for better oversight of foster homes. They advocated for policies that kept siblings together instead of separating them. They demanded better training for social workers and higher pay to attract quality professionals. They also tackled the issue that had affected Ruby directly: hospital protocols for abandoned infants. The foundation worked with hospitals across Britain to implement better security measures and tracking systems to ensure every baby could be identified and protected. Within the first year, the Sarah Harrison Foundation had helped place over 300 children in permanent, loving homes. They had lobbied successfully for two major pieces of legislation that improved foster care standards and increased funding for mental health services. The work was exhausting but fulfilling. Ruby split her time between finishing her teaching degree, working at the foundation, and spending precious hours with her grandmother. Dorothy, for her part, began stepping back from the day-to-day operations of her real estate empire. She had spent 40 years building that business, but she realized now that she had been building it for the wrong reasons. She had buried herself in work to avoid feeling the pain of losing Sarah and her grandchild. Now she wanted to actually live. She wanted time with Ruby. Time to be a grandmother. They took trips together. They visited Paris, where Sarah had been conceived during a romantic holiday. They went to Edinburgh, where Dorothy had been born. They traveled to places Dorothy had been when Sarah died. All those locations she had visited alone in her grief, she now visited with joy. And everywhere they went, they looked for ways to expand the foundation's work. They met with child welfare organizations in other countries. They studied different approaches to foster care. They brought the best ideas back to Britain. The media coverage of the foundation was extensive. News outlets that had initially covered Ruby's story as tabloid drama now wrote serious pieces about child welfare reform. Politicians took notice. Other wealthy families started their own initiatives, inspired by what Ruby and Dorothy were doing. But the most meaningful moments were the quiet ones. Like when they visited a foster home and watched children's faces light up when the foundation's mentors arrived. Like when they received letters from young people who said the foundation had changed their lives. Like when Ruby met a 16-year-old girl in foster care who reminded her so much of herself, angry, scared, convinced nobody cared. And Ruby was able to sit with that girl and say, "I was you. I know how you feel. And I'm here to tell you that you matter. Your life matters. And things can get better. The girl had cried in Ruby's arms, and Ruby had cried too. Those moments made everything worthwhile. The trial, the media attention, the painful process of confronting her past. It all had meaning now. 3 years after that life-changing Thursday in the garden room, Ruby stood at a podium in front of a packed auditorium. She wore a professional suit that her grandmother had helped her choose. And around her neck, she still wore that simple silver locket. The occasion was a major child welfare conference, and Ruby was there to present the foundation's work and vision for the future. "My name is Ruby Harrison," she began, her voice steady and clear. 30 years ago, I was stolen from my family and left to die in a hospital bathroom. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. I survived through luck and the dedication of social workers who refused to let me become another statistic. But I shouldn't have had to just survive. I should have been protected. I should have been valued. I should have been home with my family. Ruby paused, looking out at the hundreds of faces watching her. The system failed me. But I'm standing here today to tell you that we can do better. We must do better. Every child deserves to feel safe and loved. Every child deserves to know they matter. She outlined the Foundation's new initiatives. A national database to track children in care and ensure they weren't lost in the system. A mental health program that provided therapy for every foster child who needed it. A legal advocacy program to ensure children's rights were protected. "We can't change the past," Ruby continued, her voice growing stronger. "But we can shape the future. We can make sure no other child experiences what I did. No other grandmother spends decades searching for a grandchild who is stolen. No other family is destroyed by greed and cruelty." The applause was thunderous, but Ruby wasn't doing this for applause. She was doing it because she understood something profound. Having power and privilege meant nothing if you didn't use them to help others. Dorothy watched from the front row, tears streaming down her face. But these were different tears now. Not tears of grief or rage, but tears of pride. Her granddaughter had not only survived but thrived. Together, they were changing the world. After the conference, a young woman approached Ruby nervously. She was maybe 19 with tired eyes and worn clothes. "I was in foster care too," the young woman said quietly. "Your foundation helped me get into university. I start next month. I just wanted to say thank you." Ruby hugged her tightly. "You did this yourself. You're the one who worked hard and never gave up. I'm proud of you. But I wouldn't have had the chance without people like you fighting for us," the young woman insisted. "You made people see that we matter." That conversation stayed with Ruby for days. It reminded her why this work was so important. That evening, Ruby and Dorothy sat together in the penthouse, looking through old photos of Sarah. Dorothy had finally been able to bring them out without crying. She could look at her daughter's face now and smile, remembering the joy instead of just the loss. "Tell me more about her," Ruby said, as she had said countless times before. She never tired of hearing stories about the mother she never knew. Dorothy shared a memory about Sarah's terrible singing voice and how she would dance around the kitchen, making up ridiculous songs. About how Sarah had once rescued a stray cat and hidden it in her room for 2 weeks before Dorothy found it. About how Sarah had dreamed of opening a free clinic for people who couldn't afford healthcare. "She wanted to help everyone," Dorothy said softly. "She had such a big heart. I see that same heart in you." Ruby squeezed her grandmother's hand. "I wasted so many years being angry," Dorothy admitted. "After Sarah died and you disappeared, I became hard and cold. I built walls around myself because I couldn't handle any more loss. But those walls kept out everything, not just pain, but also joy and connection and love." "You're making up for it now," Ruby said gently. "We both are," Dorothy replied. The silver locket that had started everything now hung in a place of honor at the Foundation's headquarters, preserved in a glass case alongside Sarah's photo. Underneath was a plaque that read, "In memory of Sarah Harrison and in celebration of every child who survives against impossible odds. May we never forget their worth." Ruby had a replica made that she wore every day, a reminder of where she came from and where she was going. Philip, serving his sentence in prison, had written Ruby a letter full of apologies and excuses. She never responded. Some things couldn't be forgiven. Some actions had consequences that lasted forever. He would live with what he had done. She would live with what had been done to her. But she refused to let his choices define her future. The other convicted conspirators faced their own reckonings. The accountant lost everything: his career, his money, his reputation. The lawyer was disbarred and divorced. They would spend their remaining years as cautionary tales, examples of what happens when greed overpowers ethics. But Ruby didn't dwell on them. She focused instead on the children she could help, the families she could support, the systems she could change. She completed her teaching degree and began working part-time at a school in a low-income area of London. Her students loved her because she understood them. She had lived their struggles, and she never gave up on any of them, no matter how difficult they were. The rest of her time went to the foundation. The work seemed endless, but also endlessly rewarding. For years after their reunion, Ruby and Dorothy attended an award ceremony. Dorothy was receiving a humanitarian award for the foundation's work. Ruby stood at the podium to introduce her. "This woman," Ruby said, her voice filled with emotion, "is the strongest person I know. She lost her daughter. She lost decades with her grandchild. She could have let that destroy her. Instead, she channeled it into something beautiful and powerful, something that will help generations to come." Dorothy took the stage to thunderous applause. She looked out at the audience, then back at Ruby and smiled. "I've learned something important," Dorothy said into the microphone. "Money means nothing if you're alone. Power means nothing if you don't use it for good. And family is everything." She paused, her voice breaking slightly. "I would give every pound I have, every property, every business deal, every accomplishment just to have those 30 years back with my granddaughter. But since I can't have that, I'll spend whatever time I have left making sure no other family suffers what we did." When the speech ended, Dorothy walked directly to Ruby and pulled her into a long embrace. The photographers captured that moment. The billionaire and the former waitress, the grandmother and granddaughter, two women torn apart by greed and reunited by chance. But it wasn't really chance, was it? It was that locket. That small piece of silver that Sarah had somehow managed to place around her baby's neck in those final moments. That locket had traveled through 30 years of foster homes and uncertainty. It had survived being lost or stolen or forgotten. It had hung around Ruby's neck like a beacon, waiting for the right moment. Waiting for Dorothy to walk into a restaurant on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. Waiting to bring a family back together. As Ruby and Dorothy held each other, neither of them thinking about the cameras or the applause or the strangers watching, Ruby thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. All the pain and loss and years of loneliness. All the anger and grief and unanswered questions. And she realized something beautiful. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us can lead to the best things. Not because the bad things were good, they weren't. What happened to her was wrong and cruel and should never have happened. But from that darkness, light had grown. A foundation that was changing thousands of lives. A relationship with a grandmother she adored. A purpose that gave meaning to all that suffering. Ruby had spent 30 years feeling unwanted. Now she knew the truth. She had always been wanted. Always been loved. That love had been stolen from her, but it had never stopped existing. And now that love was spreading out into the world, touching other children who felt unwanted, showing them that they mattered, that they had value, that someone cared. That night, back in the penthouse, Ruby stood at the window, looking out at the city. Dorothy came to stand beside her. "Do you think she knows?" Ruby asked quietly. "My mother. Do you think she knows what we're doing?" Dorothy put her arm around her granddaughter's shoulders. "I think if there's any way for her to know, she does. And I think she's proud of you beyond measure." Ruby leaned her head against her grandmother's shoulder. "I wish I could have known her." "You do know her," Dorothy said softly. "You're just like her. The same kindness, the same determination to help others, the same beautiful heart. Sarah lives on in you." They stood there together in comfortable silence, two women who had found each other against impossible odds. Two women who had turned their pain into purpose. Two women who proved that love could survive anything, even 30 years of separation, even cruelty and theft, even death itself. The silver locket had brought them together. But it was love. Thanks for your watching. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe to the Story Room for meaningful stories that inspire and teach life lessons.